All right. In the interest of time, let me get going here. Hello, everybody. My name is Deepa Ollapally, and I'm a research professor of international affairs at the Elliott School and the associate director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. And I'm delighted that my center is co-sponsoring this event, the signature conference. And one of the best things about the Elliott School is that we get to do a lot of collegial things like this and cross-disciplinary work also. And I want to take this opportunity to actually thank my economist colleagues who actually did most of the heavy lifting. So thank you, Ajay and James. All right. It's my pleasure now to introduce the next panel, which is going to address what I see as the elephant in the room, issues of social inclusion and empowerment. We've heard mostly about India's upward economic trajectory so far, but I think the last panel began to raise some of the questions that ought to be at the center, because how meaningful is the economic growth story without understanding what it means for the disaggregated Indian population at large? How does the social base interact with developmental economics that's taking place at the national and more local levels? And then how do these things in turn function within a changing and more charged and divided body politic? I think that is what I would say is one of the central questions. Well, we have a superb speaker and a discussant lined up to talk about these issues. And we'll start with our speaker, Dr. Prerna Singh, and let me introduce her. She is chaired associate professor of political science and international public affairs at Brown University. She has a very long and really breathtaking CV, and I'll ask you to just read about her in the bio that you have. But I do want to give a few highlights. Dr. Singh is the recipient of the so-called Brainy Award from Carnegie Corporation, and I Googled to find out what that exactly was. And I got a lot of stuff that came up on neuroscience. I knew that was wrong. So I found out that it's given to a small group of scholars to recognize their original and fresh contributions to the humanities and to fund their work in the future for 2 years. So that's a big deal. This is just one of her many awards. Her 2016 book called How Solidarity Works for Welfare, Subnationalism and Social Development in India won both the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Prize for the best book in politics and international relations, as well as the American Sociological Association's Barrington Moore Prize for the best book in comparative historical sociology. She covers the gamut, as you can see. Prerna holds a PhD from Princeton University. She's a highly sought after speaker, so we're very lucky that she said yes to our invitation. You have what, 20 minutes now, I guess, or maybe 25? Does everybody else?
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And thank you for having me here today and for sticking towards the latter end of this very exciting set of presentations. I've learned a lot today, and I really want to thank Ajay for this invite. So I'm a political scientist and perhaps the first in the room today. And within political science, we consider this idea that India established democratic institutions in 1947, despite widespread poverty, ethnic diversity, and low levels of education, as the so-called puzzle of Indian democracy. And I want to push forward a little bit to say that while there is this puzzle of Indian democracy, I want to focus my remarks today on the puzzle of Indian democracy's unfulfilled potential. And so democracy is, of course, important in its own right in terms of political electoral rights. But the general idea is that democracy will also be instituted, will also be associated with better economic and political rights. And the disappointment has been that Indian democracy, even as it is perhaps at a new stage today, has been associated at the national level with both national disappointment and at the subnational level by huge subnational variation. And so you'll see my remarks today really build on the excellent panel previously, but also on remarks of speakers through the day today. So you've heard a lot about China, and you'll hear about China more explicitly right now when I talk about the fact that India and China began in terms of social development outcomes at very similar points in time at the time of Indian independence in 1947 and the Chinese Communist Party's accession to power in 1948. So literacy rates by most indicators were about 18 to 20% in India and China, and life expectancy, quite sobering, was at around 40 years. And what I want to show in terms of this, the puzzle of Indian underdevelopment is how those trajectories begin to diverge. And so this is life expectancy, and you can see that again, and I showed you that if we had this back to 1950, they're at virtually similar starting points, is how that divergence begins to take place. And we spoke about different indicators, multidimensional measures of social development, is that you will see a very similar story, irrespective of which indicator I was to show you. This, for instance, infant and under 5 mortality rates. Also for literacy rates, this is actually from Jean Drèze, and you see here again that from that very similarly low starting point of 18 to 20%, China by the early 1980s has made significant strides in terms of literacy and other educational outcomes, again, whether you look at literacy above 7 or in this case, adult literacy rates. But within this picture of national underdevelopment, there is massive subnational variation. And I published a book about this a few years ago, but just to give you a sense of what I call these different worlds of welfare, and Sadanand's question kind of referred to this at the end of the last panel, just to give you a sense, the state of Kerala, here demographically about the size of Canada, if you were a woman living in the state of Kerala in 1970, a woman in the rural countryside, you were on average expected to live 25 years more than if you happened to be born in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is in north central India and demographically the size of Russia. In terms of literacy rates, you were about 5 times more likely to be literate if you were a woman in Kerala. And so there are these massive subnational variations within a picture of national underdevelopment. But just to put this into international context, Kerala's social development actually, much through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, not only rivals, but actually outpaces that of India. So this point that these are, different countries almost, if Kerala was a country of its own, its levels of social welfare would look very different, not just today, but historically as compared to other states, for instance, in particular, Uttar Pradesh. So if we think of social development as broadly analytically a product of both state and societal action, I'm going to suggest in a room mostly full of economists and generally dominated in an environment of Homo economicus, that most of our ways of thinking about this question of social development, both under what conditions do states put in place social policies and what explains the popular involvement with these social policies, are what I call rational explanations. What I mean by this is general modernization theory, teleological explanations that economic development will eventually find its way into greater human development outlays and outcomes. And this, unfortunately, has not been the story for India for much of its post-independence trajectories. So just to give you a sense of this, economic development in China is about at the same time as India. And again, this is GDP per capita, but I could show you a number of other indicators of economic development. China really begins to take off much later in the really late 1970s and 80s. So at the time when it's beginning to overtake India in terms of pretty much every social indicator, the explanatory variable is very clearly not increases in levels of economic development. So this is to show you the limits of these rational ideas. The same logic of that all good things go together, greater economic development, higher social outlays, better social development outcomes, also doesn't play out when it comes to subnational variation. I showed you Kerala and UP as an example. Here again, you'll see that actually Kerala, even including remittances, which really only kick in from the Gulf in around the 80s and 90s is actually doing worse than the state of UP through much of the time when Kerala begins to kind of become this quote unquote developmental miracle. So if it's not rational explanations, modernization theory, economic explanations, what is? And here I'm going to put forward a kind of provocatively titled set of moral explanations by which I really refer to the role of values, ideas, and identities in explaining differences in state and societal action towards social development. So again, as I mentioned, I really think of the moral explanation as hinging on ideas and identities, but I don't for a second want you to think that I'm suggesting that these are unrelated to questions of interests and institutions, but simply that this is often an overlooked or at least underemphasized factor when we are thinking about questions of social development. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to try to explain to you how I think ideas and identities can explain this puzzle, both of a story of national disappointment in social outcomes, but also subnational variation in terms of those different worlds of welfare. And I'll begin actually with the subnational story, which, as Deepa mentioned, I have a book on, to say that here, when I talk about a moral or at least a non-rational explanation, I'm really talking about the role of identities, and in particular, the role of linguistic shared solidarities, and therefore the title, How Solidarity Works for Welfare, and in particular, again, as I said, by solidarity, I mean a shared linguistic identity. So what do I mean by this? And I'll give you a little sense of this, again, by getting into Kerala and UP, which are the two states I referred to when we were looking at the map. And just to give you a sense, again, that's the same net state domestic product. But here again are a number of other indicators that scholars might suggest help influence differences in social development. And in particularly, I want to just draw your attention because sometimes people forget that actually Kerala is the most religiously diverse state in India. And so this kind of general idea that ethnic diversity is a so-called curse for development is also one that actually would explain lower social outcomes in Kerala. And so what do I mean by a shared identity and how exactly does it work to influence social development? So I'll go very quickly over this, is when I talk about a shared identity, and this is mostly from the book that came out a few years ago now, I'm really talking about the construction. It's not demographic so much as it is a politically constructed identity. And so politics is central to the construction of a shared linguistic solidarity in Kerala and UP. And you can see this across a number of indicators that I'll briefly take you through. So one, India inherits in 1947 colonial boundaries of presidencies and princely states. It's only reorganized into a linguistic federalism in the early 1950s. And the organization that does this is the States Reorganization Commission. So one of the things I did in the book is look at all petitions submitted to this body for the creation of new states. And whether the states that we see them and internalize them and use them as today we do, were the product of a popular movement that said we want this state, or whether there was simply a continuation through inertia and path dependency of colonial boundaries. And so you will see, for instance, in the state of Kerala, and this is not unique to Kerala, you see this in Tamil Nadu through the Dravidian movement, a very active, a very charged emotional movement to unite what were previously the princely states of Travancore, Cochin, as well as the Malabar area, which was a part of Madras presidency. This gets called the Aikya Kerala movement. This is actually talking about the role of textbooks and education in the inculcation of this identity. So I looked at I looked at history textbooks to see the shared myth about the Lord Parsuram and his axe as a North Indian from Delhi. This was very new to me when I was doing this research. Sorry about the clicker, it's a little sticky and I think I have sweaty fingers. So this is Namboodiripad addressing, as you can tell, a quite large gathering. He is the head of the Communist Party, but the Communist Party in Kerala really functions as much as a sub-nationalist party and is at the helm of the demand for the creation of Kerala. You see again in the 1950s, the state of Kerala is busy petitioning the Nehru government to say, this is our national art form, this is our national festival. And the key thing I want you to remember is that this is across religious lines. And so Onam, they are at pains to inform people in Delhi, is a festival that, unlike in North India, is celebrated equally by Christians, Muslims, as well as Hindus. And so you see this, to highlight here, this active political construction of a shared linguistic solidarity. So now we turn to the state of UP. No shared distinctive language. Hindi, if we do think that UP speaks Hindi, is a language that is shared by every one of UP's neighbors. Not just that, this is a map from 1931 from a colonial, the kind of gazetteer of the United Provinces as it was known. And you can see here the kind of marking of these different quote unquote cultural regions that actually correspond to what we today refer to, again, political construction as dialects, but which all linguists would consider as distinct languages. And so this, so again, no shared language, no distinctive language. And in particular, I just want to very quickly go over this debate over name. So again, we think of this as something that's kind of set in stone. Uttar Pradesh, it used to be called the Northern Western Provinces and Awadh. It became the United Provinces of Agra and Awadh in 1902. Crook said that, he was the kind of Governor General of UP, he said, it's really hard to find a suitable name for this rather heterogeneous slice of the empire. And it's interesting that fast forward to 1950, India's constitution is being written and is held up because one state in India does not have a name. And that state is Uttar Pradesh. And so there's an emergency meeting called of the UP Legislative Assembly, and they suggest almost 20 different names. And I'm happy to give you references for really interesting books around this. 20 different names to the Constituent Assembly of India. And as you read some of them, Krishna Kushal Province, Ram Krishna Prant, you can kind of get a sense of what's going on. Eventually, they settle and send to the Constituent Assembly of India Aryavrat. Aryavrat is rejected, saying that, sorry, that's not an appropriate name. That refers, interestingly, the reason for the rejection is that it refers to all of India, not just to UP. So it's sent back, shot down by the Constituent Assembly. They can't agree. So finally, actually, the constituent in Delhi decides that it's going to be called Uttar Pradesh. And for anyone who's a Hindi Urdu speaker, that's actually not a natural name. Kerala, there was never a debate about this name. They said it had existed forever. It's a geographic appellation. And here I want to refer to the other state that has one, Madhya Pradesh, right? And so it just becomes Northern Provinces. Nehru says that that's great. It keeps the same acronym as the United Provinces. And so I could go on. This is a story of its emblem, its seal. If you ever receive a letter, I have received numerous from the government of Uttar Pradesh, the letter only has this like a little teeny part for you to be able to write in because the seal is so large. And the reason why the seal is so large, actually, interestingly, the Governor General, oh, sorry, Maddie, I'm having trouble again. So in 1923, the governor, William Morris, refused to use the seal. He said it's a hodgepodge of symbols. What you see here are two fish from the state of Awadh. That's the two rivers, Ganga and Yamuna, and that's Ram's Dhanush, bow and arrow. And so you can see here again, the political failure to construct a shared identity, and instead this kind of lopping together of identities, which works till a point in time. And again, States Reorganization Commission, there's a dissenting note. The only state with a dissenting note is UP. One of the three people says it shouldn't exist. It's too bulky. And then finally, actually, UP is divided into the state of Uttarakhand, a kind of culmination of what was the original proposal in the 1950s. This is Shankar, for those of you who know it, was this great political commentator. And he says, the crisis, the identity crisis for UP is that it thinks it's all of India. So UP goes from being driven on the one hand by these kind of caste religious identities, which you saw in the debate over the names, and I could talk more about this, to a kind of like national level identification. But what suffers is the subnational identity and therefore the subnational outlays. So the UP budget pretty much mirrors the national lack of emphasis on both education and health. So I'm going to go pretty quickly, but just to point out, is that look at this. I mean, Kerala and UP had relatively almost identical female literacy rates in the first colonial census that we can go back to in 1901. And my argument in the book that I show is that it is that shared subnational solidarity that begins to kick in really from 1901, such that even by the end of the colonial period, you begin to see the divergences. And then if I took you all to 2001 or 2011, we don't yet have the census results from 2021, that becomes the gap just keeps growing. Okay, so I'm going to take you, because I saw my half-time mark, to the other story. And so this is the book that I'm working on right now, which is the story that within the sub-national variation at the national level, in some way reflecting UP, we see a story of national disappointment. And here, when I talk about the role of identities, I'm really talking about, the role of ideas. And so the moral framework is identities in the first book and really ideas in the second. And what I want to try to convince you today in the rest of the time that I have is that these ideas of rule, and I have China there in the gray as your kind of comparison, because as a comparative political scientist, what unites us is Irfan and I'm honored that he's discussing today, is that we compare. And so part of, I think, you begin to see what's going on in India if you have China as a kind of just general comparison. So India's post-colonial elites put in place what I'm terming a scientific secular modernity, and I'm happy to talk more about this. But key aspects of this vision, this idea of development, is a certain kind of Western liberalism, a deep elitism, and these are not arguments that are new to me. Many folks have made this before, and a kind of absolute crowning of techno-scientific expertise as the driving motor for development, both economic and social. That is combined with what, again, is not, and this is not original, is deep caste-based anxieties of its ruling elite, mostly men, mostly high caste. Myron Weiner has written a lot about this, so have others. It's reflected in the neglect of primary education. Not everyone, some people need to work with their hands, others need to work with their heads, and also critically in health policy in terms of the focus on family planning, preventing reproduction of the, quote, wrong sorts. And you see this language in post-colonial health reports again and again. And so I want to just contrast this with, of course, very similar elitism, and there is also an obsession. It's also the 1950s. And so, this is also the kind of zeitgeist. But the techno-scientific expertise is combined in China with an accommodation with indigenous knowledge. And these caste-based anxieties, this kind of deep skepticism about giving education and controlling the masses is, on the other hand, contrasted in China with the Maoist mass line, to the people, for the people, by the people. And so the key thing, and actually, I was at Harvard before Brown, and so I was kind of just like going over initial ideas of this, and someone at Harvard Business School said, well, it's like a business model. And I'd never really thought about it before. He said, are your employees an asset or are they a liability? And so in some ways, what I want to kind of suggest is that in the founding idea of development for India, the people were, and in some ways remain, a liability. In China, on the other hand, they were an asset. What does this mean? It means you have a kind of benevolent paternalism. Shri Rupa Roy has talked about how Nehru consistently refers to the citizen as this kind of infantile citizen who needs to be educated, uplifted, and a consistent reference in reports, for instance, of the Community Development Program, which is India's flagship development program in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, to this need for uplift. Again, contrast this. That's Mao, the masses are the real heroes, while we ourselves are often childish and ignorant. And eventually what it comes down to is that this idea that the people are a liability means that, of course, there is a developmental discourse, but it always ends with this kind of neo-civilizing language of the people needing to be controlled or uplifted, versus in China, of course, often with devastating consequences, like in the Great Leap Forward, to be mobilized. But it's a mobilizational logic, while here it's a kind of bureaucratic controlling logic. So of course, there are a lot of similarities in terms of the focus on economic growth, industrialization through heavy industry, the modernization of agriculture, and of course, the building of big infrastructure. Both Mao and Nehru are huge fans of that. Dams, of course, are the temples of modern India. But remember, if dams are the temples of modern India, your education policy will need to create those men who will worship at the temples. And so you have the kind of creation of this corpse of very high caste men in IITs who are deliberately, because India needs engineers. And so that, so this prioritization begins to influence, you will see, and dictate social development policy. So there's a low investment in the common people because of these kind of ideas that I mentioned, and a general neglect of social development. While on the other hand, if your people are an asset, you will invest in them. How do you see this? Well, for one, in the Constitution of India, until the 1990s, education is not even a concurrent subject. So the Constitution of India divides all issues into central issues, state issues, concurrent issues. Concurrent means both have jurisdiction. Central means only the center. So think, monetary policy, finance, defense. And state issues are basically relegated to the state. And both education and health are state issues, and therefore that huge subnational variation that you see. So Myron Wiener's point is that the neglect of primary education is inseparable from the tolerance for child labor. He says, lower caste children are not to be educated, they're to be used for the development of the economy. But what you see are, of course, dismal education outlays. You've seen that referred to before, but also lopsided priorities. So, 80% of India cannot read or write its name, but a majority of the budget goes to higher and tertiary education. You see the opposite in China. Again, you see the building of incredible infrastructure like the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in Delhi, but that is specialized medicine, while you see a complete neglect of primary education, while it is the opposite in China. What you do see again in terms of the commonality is a shared commitment to vertical top-down single disease control campaigns. Again, this is somewhat reflecting the zeitgeist. I'm almost done. And so you see this in terms of the real fascination with malaria control and DDT spraying, with the BCG vaccination and tuberculosis. And that is the topic of my book, is why the world's first vaccine, which was against smallpox. But the difference here is that, and COVID has made us so aware of this, is that the government can do all this, but eventually the rubber hits the road when people agree to take these vaccines. And so popular compliance is absolutely critical to states' compliance capacity. And here is where India struggles. And so this part of it, so far I've kind of really mentioned the state action part of it. This part of it, the popular involvement with social services, is where India and China are really distinguished. And so you see a huge degree of popular hesitation, reluctance, if not quite active opposition. For the new book, which is called Moral Vaccination, I've been looking at these kind of hidden journals in India's Information and Broadcasting Ministry, which were called Kurukshetra. And so you see here, I'm sorry, it's not the greatest scan, but this kind of general idea that as soon as the vaccinator comes into a village, the people flee and they hide, and again they resort to what the state terms unlicensed practitioners. And here, these unlicensed practitioners, just to give you that comparative context again, are actively bought into the state during the Maoist period, but that scientific secular modernity of the Nehruvian period completely means that these unlicensed practitioners, the indigenous healers, are never brought into the fold and become the kind of active opponents and alternatives to a very minimal state health sector in the first place. Okay, and I argue that why are we seeing this? I argue that this too, very important to this, are ideas of rule. And what do I mean? So you can see again and again through these journals, through this archival work, that the elitism, the caste-based anxieties, and this benevolent paternalism dictates not just that health is not prioritized, but also how it is delivered, when it is delivered, for instance, through these single disease campaigns. And so again, this is not a great scan, but you can see these are kind of the westernized elite. They've got a telescope, they've got a magnifying glass, and they're looking at the Indian villagers. And so the general idea, of great contrast to China, where the idea is to learn from the people, is to kind of understand these, again, and this is language from post-independence Indian reports, the backward, ignorant, this very resonant Hindi-Urdu word called gawar, which is almost a slur. And it literally just refers to someone from the countryside. And so you see here again, I could show you many, but I'm going to end, and I'll just end by concluding, is again, you see the depiction of the doctor. This is the doctor, he's got glasses, he's got a coat, a tie. For anyone who's been in India at any point in time, that's not what you might expect a rural doctor to look like. And these portrayals again and again of the kind of rural folk, you can see, I look at these as kind of manifestations of this kind of scientific, secular, rational ideas of rule. And eventually it all comes down to here. I mean, essentially it says in Hindi here that rather than coming to the vaccinator, they decided to sacrifice some chickens. And so you see, because of this kind of scientific, this kind of real belief clinging to the scientific secular modernity, a state that for the most part is unable to create any kind of affective relationship with the people, which I argue stands in the way of its being able to gain popular compliance. Okay, it also happens because, of course, if you don't, it's linked. If you don't prioritize education, you're essentially cutting off your primary method of being able to inculcate citizenship and nationalism, which has historically happened through schools. And so it's related. But I want to end by bringing it, especially because the conference really is about looking at India today and looking at India in the future, is what's happening today, and to link it in some ways to some of the presentations you heard this morning. And so I got you at the end of the presentations to say that these ideas of rule not only impede states' initiation, state action, the policies, but they also impede societal action, popular cooperation with state directives. And what I want to kind of just venture, again, more as a hypothesis, as really quite so much as evidence, well, a hypothesis with some evidence, is that what's changed in India, maybe in the last decade, is there have been huge increases, huge underappreciated increases in compliance capacity. The Indian citizenry seems far more willing to go along, if not cooperate, with state policies than it has before. And you can see that, I think Sajid mentioned today, that tax to GDP ratio has been rising in India. That's a classic indicator in the social science scholarship for compliance capacity, because it's direct taxes versus, say, taxes on trade or other form of taxes. And if eventually that's where it heads, I want to suggest that and we really haven't spoken about political institutions. So if you think of ideas of rule today, of course, Hindu nationalism is a very important idea of rule that is virtually hegemonic in India today. And I want to suggest is that this idea of rule has actually had a very powerful affective quality for a majority of Indians in terms of encouraging a degree of popular compliance. And you see this not just in the increase in the tax GDP ratio, but for instance, in the dog that doesn't bark, the absolute lack of protest against a policy like demonetization. So compliance is seen both when people come on board with state schemes, but it's also seen when citizens do not protest a state scheme that you might think they could, and that's demonetization for you. And eventually, again, to kind of return to Anant and Sajid's presentations in the morning, how do we improve human development? We need to raise more revenues. We need to raise the tax GDP ratio, and their compliance capacity becomes absolutely critical. And so in some ways, it's all endogenous, it's linked, but I know I'm out of time. And so I'll stop and thank you for your patience and attention.
Thank you, Prerna, for that fascinating discussion. And now, very quickly, let me turn to my colleague Irfan Nooruddin, who's a colleague and friend from Georgetown, which I won't hold against him. He is extremely well-known as a professor of Indian politics. He ran and founded something called the India Initiative and brought a very exciting and dynamic program to the city, which I haven't seen in some time now. So you get, well, maybe 7 minutes or less if you can manage that.
Okay, let's see. Good afternoon. As Deepa Kani said, my name is Irfan Nooruddin. I'm a professor at Georgetown, and a real pleasure to be speaking here today. Congratulations to my friend Ajay Chibber and his colleagues at GW for organizing this 4th annual conference. I've known Prerna for many years now. She never fails to disappoint, and she didn't this afternoon either. She has both the desi capacity to speak more words per minute but also sort of the rare intellectual ability to have each of those words be completely profound so that every sentence builds on the previous sentence in a way that makes the discussant's job both a lot of fun, but also pretty intimidating because, trying to figure out what you can say that adds value is pretty challenging. So Prerna, what I'm going to do, both address to you, but also to spark conversation, is really to take 3 or 4 different points that I think bear further conversation, some of which will hopefully push you as you work on the book, which I'm very excited to see, having seen earlier versions as well, and some of which maybe just to sort of pose bigger policy questions as we look forward. So the first is, I think any comparison of India and China in the way that you so bravely make over here, that doesn't refer to communism and democracy has to be challenged. So you and I are both sort of acolytes of Amartya Sen, right? And in that sense, I can't help but think of Sen's argument, familiar to, I'm sure, everyone in the room, that a full conception of human development is both one that privileges economic and social uplift, a word that now I will have to be careful using, knowing some of the pejorative context of it, but also democratic rights and political freedoms, right? And in that sense, a dimension of development that you elide over here, right? India was able to deliver to all its citizens in 1947 in a way that the Chinese people still don't have, right? And so one wants to be careful about suggesting that political rights can be quantified or sort of made equivalent, be traded against sort of better literacy, better food security, etc. But one doesn't go without the other. And arguably, what you're really telling us over here is that for better for worse, communism had some real advantages in a single party dominant system to deliver social progress to its citizens in a way that a really messy, multi-party, very competitive federal democracy struggled in a way that, as a political scientist, I could tell you 15 reasons that democratic systems might fail to do some of the things you want them to do that have nothing to do with the ideas of rules, simply to do with what citizens are demanding and sort of competition and all of that. So I think we have to talk about that, and the fact that Kerala, which is of course the exemplar for all the good things that happen in India, God's own country, as it were, right, is ruled at least normally by a communist party, right, suggests that there might be something more than just the cross-national comparison that you have to grapple with. The second is sort of this suggestion that India's ideas of rule can be uncovered by the fact that education and public health are part of the state list and not on the national list. And I kind of want to push you on this because I fundamentally disagree with your interpretation of that fact. So one, just as historical, and Prerna knows this, I know, but India's constitution divides state, national, and concurrent lists. But those lists which were put in the constitution in 1950 were copied wholesale, copy-paste, from the Government of India Act in 1935, which in turn was copied pretty much wholesale from the Motilal Nehru UPSC report of 1928, right? So the idea that education and healthcare were going to be state subjects, right, was baked in for 20 years before that. And you can read the Constituent Assembly debates, and they're agonizing about education, but what they're never debating is whether education should be at the national level or the state level. Where it does come up is the North Indian state representatives at the Constituent Assemblies arguing vehemently that education should be in Hindi, right? And this was very much part of the Hindi as national language. And the southern states saying, hell no, right, in so many words. And so what is interesting is that to the extent that education as a state versus national subject gets debated, it is actually in the context of UP thinking that it is all of India, right? And therefore that it becomes a national language kind of fight. And in fact, there's a lot of them talking about, even if we want them to learn Hindi, these are people from the South, even if we want them to learn Hindi as a national language, to teach someone from Tamil Nadu or Kerala Hindi, they'd be learning it as a foreign language. We have to do primary education in their home mother tongue before they can learn other languages. So the case for state school education being a state school was actually part of your linguistic identity story, I think, in a way that I would argue that you need to think a little more, not more carefully, you're so careful, but maybe look at it from the other perspective, is that in fact, by allowing the states to be in charge, you in fact reinforce some of the positive of that linguistic shared solidarity, which gets reinforced. As a child growing up in Bombay, I learned more about Shivaji and the great Maratha kingdoms, right? But than anything else. But that's partly what creates that Maratha identity among Maharashtrians, arguably, which by your argument, should be a positive thing for all sorts of other things. The second, if you think about the fact that we're right now sitting in the midst of World Bank IMF week, right? Subtitled Benevolent Paternalism for the entire week, right? But probably the most powerful intellectual framework being used for thinking about better delivery of services to poor people is, in fact, decentralization, federalizing them, right? The TIBO model of bringing it closer to the people as opposed to away from the national level. So again, if we were sort of ignoring all of this, we're just saying we were in the room, knowing what we know as academics 70 years later, I would be surprised if we weren't advising them to say, don't let Delhi run education policy from the national level. In fact, decentralize it as far down the pike as you can. And in fact, you want the states to be in charge, and then you want districts to be empowered. In the US, public school districts, right, or school districts are the real arbiters of this power. So it's not even at the state level, but states are far more important in education policy than is the national government, right? Those people have tried to change that. All right, point number 3. I think this question that Prerna fundamentally raises in the first book, which if you haven't read, I highly encourage, it's absolutely fabulous, is the question of why we get this subnational shared solidarity based on linguistic patterns in some states, South India mainly, South and Eastern India as well, but not in North India, the Hindi heartland. And there I wonder whether or not that is in fact endogenous to whether you perceive yourself to be a majority or a minority in the nation and how you think about that. So if we were to be comparativists and think about the case in which we live, the United States, my guess is that the strongest subnational identity exists in what we would call the Deep South today, right? And that Alabamians sort of, I think about that, Texas thinks about that identity far more than maybe someone growing up in Pennsylvania having a Pennsylvania identity. And I wonder, just thinking out loud, whether that is partly projecting that we already think of ourselves as being the representative model American, if you grew up in Pennsylvania, and so that you don't need that. You identify with the national identity, but if you're in Alabama or Mississippi, you very much feel that you need to defend it. And I wonder whether that's what you get in the South as well. So that in fact, what you're picking up over here is not that we failed to get this in the North, but that the North never sought it, because for them, state identity and national identity were coterminous with each other. 2 final points. There's a lot of talk in the language of the communists from that Prerna's talking about China, in fact, but the most provocative idea in the talk, which I'm going to have to grapple with for myself for a while, is that the Indian state sees its citizens as liability and the Chinese communist state saw it as asset. And he said, at one point, minus the Great Leap Forward. That's a pretty big minus, right? But we got to sort of think about how to think about that. But I do think that's a really fascinating point that we need to grapple with. And I wondered there whether the book would benefit more from really thinking about the ideology that underpins that, right? A communist framework, a Marxist framework, should have us think about citizens against elites differently than a non-communist system, right? So in both cases, we have a privileging of what we think of as the people, right, against someone else. In democratic systems, this takes the form of populism, in which we also sort of raise the people again. So demonetization, right, was not, I think, a case of compliance as much as a case of kunness, right? Lots and lots of Indians being perfectly comfortable with the notion that lots of rich people were getting it stuck to them all of a sudden, because most people didn't have 1,000 rupee and 2,000 rupee notes sitting in their lockers, right? They knew who did, right? And they were happy to see those people kind of get screwed for a moment, even if it caused other sorts of things. And we see this in other parts of the world as well, where populism is, again, in some sense, talking about the people as being the true Indians, or the true Americans, or the true Hungarians, or the true Brazilians, or whatever it is, against the elites. But populism seems to have a very different dynamic in terms of social service delivery than communism does. And I think that might be worth pushing on. Final point is out-migration, which is not talked about over here. And maybe it's come up earlier in the day, but I was just listening to Devesh Kapoor speak on some of this new research that he's been doing. One out of, per him, and someone can check the stats, per him, 1 out of every 2 graduates of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences now lives outside India, right? It is maybe the greatest subsidy to medical education any country has ever done. Most graduates of the IITs and the IIMs now live outside of India, right? And India, on the other hand, has now created 5 new colleges a day, including weekends, every day for the last 30 years. Okay. 5 new colleges or universities every day, including weekends, 7 days a week, every day for the last 30 years. And yet the IITs have a 40% faculty vacancy rate, right? And so part of the trick over here, I think, for those of us now looking forward, not your responsibility, but everyone else's, right, is if you're thinking of, and this is also true of the public health, is what is the staffing model? How do we get quality teachers in these schools? What actually is the outlay that maps on to doing quality education? In some sense, we need a model of education of public health, right, that actually takes seriously who's actually doing the training. I'm not suggesting that all those IIT and AMs grads would have gone to been teachers, but the truth of the matter is that you and I are both here, right, even though we were educated there, right, as is true for so many of our colleagues in the room and around the States. And that was not the same situation in China. And in fact, even today, we see much more patent work, research work, innovation work at university levels in China, where they created a completely indigenous scientific establishment in a way that India simply has not succeeded in doing. And so that's a much bigger challenge, in some ways much more depressing, because it suggests that these problems might take a long time to solve. But thanks, Prerna, for the fabulous talk.
Okay, well, you heard some very sophisticated analysis on the plot here, and I just had one quick, first of all, do I get 5 minutes extra? Yeah, into the. So very quickly, one of the things, Prerna, that you raised was a sort of a correlation at the end about compliance capacity going up and kind of correlating it with the Hindu nationalism, kind of the new ideology. And to what extent? That's fine. I'll hand it to him in a minute.
No, I've got it.
Oh, you've got it. Okay. To what extent do you think that is a something that is going to color the whole, in a sense, the economic aspects of development? Because if there is more compliance and you put up the, the tax rate, and leaving aside demonetization, but is this new ideology then going to get Indians to do more that the government wants? And if so, are you suggesting that that is a new model that's going to deliver the goods in a positive way? Because there's also, of course, the other question of social inclusion, and you didn't mention anything about caste and communal, which are 2 big issues in the story. You alluded to it with Kerala, but you didn't really talk about it. I know that's a big question, but I had to raise them.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, and you can.
Do I have a couple of minutes to respond to you and Irfan?
You
I'm
can,
so
and
happy
to Irfan,
Yeah.
yes, before I
No,
turn
thank
it
you so
over.
much. I just want to start by saying it's always such an honor and treat to have Irfan as a discussant. And so I just wanted to respond very briefly to just a couple of the points. And so, of course, communism versus democracy, that's the big elephant in the room. But I think part of this project began to push exactly against that. And I think what I didn't get an opportunity to mention to, of course, the shadow case here, the kind of exemplar of communism is Russia. Right? And to kind of look at the contrast between China and Russia in terms of what is it that the state is able to call upon its citizens to do in China, and what is it that distinguishes Chinese communism from Russian communism, and also to keep in mind that according to most theories of comparative politics, and we can banter about this, you would imagine that democracies would actually do a better job at instituting social policy. I mean, that's the kind of promise of democracy. And so in some ways, even though, of course, democracy is messy, that messiness doesn't enter kind of elite echelons of policy making. I mean, India has not allowed the messiness of democracy to impede, a science, a space policy that has led to Chandrayaan today. And so I think there is a certain insularity of social policy making that I don't think we can kind of excuse it because of a kind of messiness of democratic politics. I mean, I think you mentioned Sen, and I think Sen and Dres have this great argument in Hunger and Public Action, that, and this refers to the Great Leap Forward, is that China has had famine. India has not had famine, right? And that is because of democracy. But the mechanisms there are really not popular accountability. They are a free press and an opposition. And so I do think that in some ways, the reason why this project began and the reason why you heard more historical work on it was because I want to kind of, in a way, push against this idea that Indian democracy somehow absolves it or explains a lack of underdevelopment. I think you're absolutely right. And also to say that Kerala and China, for me, what their communism shares is the fact that their communism is nationalist communism. I mean, it's a really deep Malayali communism. When I spent time in the archives of the Communist Party of India, you could forget that this was actually a communist party. If you look at their manifestos, you have references to Marx, Lenin, Stalin. Page 8, page 9, the front and center is Parshuram. I really didn't know who he was. A government that takes care of the Malayali people, an agenda for pushing Onam, for pushing Kathakali and these kind of national art forms. And if you look at the Chinese Communist Party, Liz Perry and others have written about this. It is a nationalist party. It's a sinicized communism. And that in some ways kind of explains that kind of relationship to society that it's been able to forge. I think you're absolutely right to push me on education and health being on state lists. I take everything that you've said. I think I just say that I think of it as a lack of state commitment, because the state could have changed it. I mean, we always learn in civics, India is a federation with a unitary bias. Why? Because it has a lot of stuff on the central list, which you wouldn't imagine. Or why not put health and education on the concurrent list? That seems easy enough, right? But I think the fact that you mentioned that lineage between that Motilal Nehru report to the Government of India report to the Constitution of India, in some ways, I think refers to my point that there's much more continuity between colonial and post-colonial India than there is a disjuncture.
Yep.
And I think finally, you're absolutely right. And that's a brilliant point about populism. And I think it really ties into Deepa's point about nationalism, because I think that's what's happening today. And I'm still grappling with it. And so there's something that's happening, of course, I would really refer to this in terms of a kind of compliance or cooperation by the kind of ethnic majority in India. But there is something happening with that mix of populism and nationalism that is allowing the state to speak a language and have a vocabulary and an affective connection that I think is new. Now, whether that allows it to enter a new economic model that allows it to raise tax for GDP ratios, which then kind of becomes the revenue base upon which human development is built. I mean, there are a lot of arrows there, but I think this part of it, which is that the Indian state has struggled with compliance capacity. And as I said, with the Great Leap Forward, compliance has a dark shadow, because if you're asking for compliance with the wrong stuff, that's the Great Leap Forward. And I think that's a very important lesson. So the policy has to be right. And I think that I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm now ready to open the floor to questions, and thanks for your patience.
We have a hand over here.
Sorry, yes. And you have yes, you. And just identify yourself, please.
Thank you for that beautiful talk and presentation. I want to build on Irfan's points, especially about the democracy, communism. So as I was listening to you, I was wondering if the commonality is, or the driving difference embedded in there is elite consolidation of power, right? Because you said, they were worried that people are a liability in India, and the whole anti-casteism, inheriting the colonial structure. The concern was, how does the dominant class stay in power? Communist Party doesn't have to worry about that, and they can focus on economic growth, which led me to think, when you talked about the current state, that now the dominant party or the dominant class has established its dominance. They feel safe. It's a very, very scary takeaway lesson here, that to have social development, there's a tension there, obviously, and an irony to have social development. The dominant class has to feel safe, but.
Okay, is there a question, please?
Her thoughts
just an
on that.
observation. Okay, all right. Thank you. Yes. If there are others, I'll take a couple more.
Hi.
And please identify yourself.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Shreyas. I work at CSIS with the US India team. Thank you for the great talk and for your equally kind remarks. Having been to academic conferences, I know how intense it can get, so I love the camaraderie here. But sort of on the point of doing a comparative study between or taking into context sort of the different political structures in China and India, right? Is there space to problematize how you think of accountability? Like one example that I can think of right now is, China dealt with a very severe air pollution sort of problem, right? And the citizens there were able to sort of express them in certain ways, and the government, whatever capacity, it did sort of respond, right? And there was sort of a change
I'm
in.
sorry, we're so out of time that I
But
just want
the
you to
same
speak
sort of
up.
situation exists in India, right? But you don't find a government that is as responsive, right? So it's sort of basically the problematization of how do you think of democratic accountability?
Okay, and gentleman behind, right there, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Amit Mukherjee. I had the privilege of being a civil servant in India for about 15 years. To your point about people being seen as, or citizens being seen as liabilities, I think it's much more nuanced. It varies very much from state to state. In Bengal, for instance, when the left front government was in power, which was the longest popularly elected communist government in the world, I think they saw people not as liabilities. In fact, they empowered the people at the grassroots level, and people like us who are
Again,
civil
if you could
servants.
please ask a question, just.
Do you have a framework for nuancing this? Because India is such a large country and it has so much of variation that to simply make a blanket statement like that seems a little bit counterintuitive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And last, oh, sorry, I can't even see you. 4 minutes left.
We can just
Okay.
collect questions. I'm happy to collect
Okay,
questions.
any more questions? Was there? Okay,
There's a question in the front row.
in the front row, yes, Vikram. Very short. Yes, we know you. You won't be short.
First of all, thank you so much for excellent contributions. The very short question is, Prerna, is there a little bit of a post hoc ergo propter hoc element in your presentation?
Could you say, I'm going to make the worst thing. Could you say a little more, please? Sorry.
Post hoc ergo propter hoc is when you take a situation and you look at the differences and then you go back in time and look at differences and argue that those are the causes of the current situation. I mean, the clear challenge is to draw a causal connection,
Of course.
which is not attributable to any other differences between those two variables.
No, absolutely. And I think,
Okay.
sorry.
I think that if that's it, then we'll turn to Prerna.
Very quickly
and
to
if you have anything.
to the last point, I think I think you raise a methodological challenge for comparative historical analysis. And I think that what a comparative historical analysis can bring, that a kind of identification strategy or an experimental design, how it supplements that is by looking at causal mechanisms. And so I think part of what we can do is to answer the how, and of course, to try to control for as many alternative explanations as we can. And that's, I think, where I'm being pushed by Irfan, and I think rightly so, as well as by Nita, in terms of, what else is going on that might be doing this. And so in the book, I have observational data and kind of regression analysis, but in other work, I have done experimental work. And so one of my articles in comparative political studies uses a survey experiment to expose people in India, and this is quite interesting because it's 2012, to the flag of India. And we find that exposure to the flag of India leads Hindu respondents in an online survey to be more generous towards Muslim, engage in more pro-social behavior towards Muslim victims of an accident as compared to the control group. And so the general idea is that kind of a shared national solidarity encourages the dominant ethnic group to actually be more pro-social, even across the rival ethnic boundary. Now, whether that holds today, I'm not sure, but that's just to say that there's other work that I've done that's more in an experimental vein. And I think here the challenge is to be able to draw causal connections through comparative work while controlling for alternative arguments. And I think the point about the accountability within, so, Lily Sayer's book is called Accountability Without Democracy. It's on China. And I think you make a really great point about how democratic institutions need not ensure accountability, and accountability can persist in a non-democratic context. As the daughter of a civil servant, I will plead guilty to not paying attention to the subnational variation that I center in my first book. But just to push back against Bengal to say that, Bengal instituted tenancy reform, but never gave land to the tiller the way that Kerala did. So even its commitment, and I argue there's a really strong Bhadralok communist component there, stopped short of actually giving land, which Kerala does. And I'll stop because I sense a general being out of time, but also to turn it over to you.
I want to give Irfan a chance.
I think just on the question of democracy, the challenge, I think, for democracy is that we have one tool for expressing discontent or happiness, and that's vote. And that vote ends up being on partisan lines where we have to vote for one party, but on maybe a constellation of issues, right? And I think the legitimacy crises that authoritarian governments face is that all issues of bad performance could be the thing that brings people into the streets, right? And so air pollution becomes an issue that you got to shut down. In a democracy, the way you express your unhappiness with the air pollution in India, and my colleague Neeta Rudra is working on this project, the puzzle of why is it that we don't have more protests against it, is that when it comes to this election over here, air pollution is but one of 1,000 things that are on your mind. And whether or not it's going to lead you to switch your vote is very, very unlikely. I might be very unhappy with a bunch of things that President Biden has done. I guarantee you that I will vote for him in August, right? I mean, it's or in November, right? And so the challenge over there with the vote is that it's a very crude tool for enforcing accountability on particular policy issues, right? Whereas protest, mobilization in the streets is much more powerful, right, as a way of doing it. And one thing, at least China, and this is what Lily Tsai and others have argued in the context of China, is that the Chinese government's concern about losing legitimacy by popular protest, because the whole thing is predicated on we're speaking for the people, is so acute that it has successfully used local level protests as a way of finding out who's not performing at a high level sort of thing. So I think it's a fundamental challenge of whether or not the vote and democratic norms are sufficient in this accountability kind of way, or whether what we need are, is much more local sort of enforcement where there can be circulation over there. But it's a fabulous question, Shreyas, and I appreciate you asking it. Thanks, Deepa.
Okay, thank you so much. I think the panelists and the discussant have given such a lot of thought-provoking comments. And I also want to thank you especially for giving so much praise to Kerala, since I'm a Malayali. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.